time to talk paints. So let's cover the paints themselves first of all. So there's a few different types of paint you can use. The original, the old school paint that I grew up with when I started model making was enamel paint. It's good stuff, covers well, airbrushes well, paints well with the brush. You need to thin it with white spirit, so it's not terribly environmentally friendly or particularly good for you, and it's starting to die out really now. There are good acrylic paints that you can use instead. But if you have some, or if for certain tasks enamels are particularly useful, but don't worry if you don't have any. We're going to concentrate on using acrylics for everything that we're going to look at, as much as we can, that we're going to look at in this series of videos anyway. Tamiya paints, they're acrylic, but they're not very good for brush painting. They're great for spraying, they airbrush really well, but again, we're going to try and avoid those for this series of videos because their brush painting qualities aren't terribly good. The latest kind of types of model making paint are acrylics. They come in a little pot like this that you squeeze a couple of drops out and then use. These are Vallejo, but AK and various other manufacturers make very similar paints in a million different colour ranges. Don't buy all the colours you think you might need ever. Buy a couple of colours that you need for your particular project at the moment, plus some sort of standard colours that you're going to need, and that would be white and a dark grey. I wouldn't bother going with a black, because very few things are actually black. But with your white and your dark grey, you've then got most tones of grey covered, and buy your green and brown, or whatever it is you need for your aircraft or tank, as you go along, and you'll build up a collection as you do different models. But these are really good. They also do a range called Model Air, which are made for airbrushing, and they're already diluted. To be honest, I've not really airbrushed much with these. I've tended to use them with a paintbrush, and they paint pretty well. They don't dilute terribly well with water, but you don't need to dilute them very much, if at all anyway. And they work nicely. Their metallic range of these are very, very good. The steel is a really convincing, shiny metal colour. Now, one thing you will notice with these types of acrylic paints is that they dry out very quickly if you just put them in a pot, or if you're trying to apply them straight from the bottle. So I'd recommend this thing. This is a homemade wet palette. What it is an airtight box. Your Tupperware box will be absolutely fine, and a piece of washing up sponge that's placed in the bottom, and this is soaked so that it's soaking wet. You shouldn't have a puddle of water on here, but if you soak that sponge, pour all the water out of the box so the sponge is really wet, put that back in, and then a bit of baking paper or greaseproof paper on top. Your dots of paint can then be placed on there and mixed, and they will stay workable for a few days. In fact, it can really last a long time. If you're painting with enamels, then just the lid of a jam jar is going to be perfect. But if you paint with acrylics in this, they will dry up very, very quickly. So the wet palette is really useful for acrylics, no use for enamels. But yeah, if I'm doing Tamiya paints or if I'm doing enamel paints, I'll mix a bit of white spirit in one of these. You're going to need some brushes to put this stuff on with. And generally speaking, I would say just a cheap set of brushes from your local high street art store. Stations, whatever. These cost about £3 for an entire pack of brushes, and the flat ones in particular are really, really good and really useful. They'll do you for most of your painting. I do have a nice high quality brush, and these are very expensive. This is mainly for figure painting, but one good small paintbrush is good for details. This is a size 1. I wouldn't really recommend going any smaller than that. A good quality brush will have a fine tip, so it can still do very fine detail. So it's worth getting one decent brush. And then I've got one not so decent brush. I don't know if you can see on this, but the head of this is absolutely battered. But this is a really useful tool. An old toothbrush. That's useful for all sorts of tasks in model making, from cleaning up scribed lines, applying mud and dirt, all sorts of things. So keep your old toothbrushes, particularly if they're nice stiff ones like this. When it comes to metallic colours, pencils and pens really useful. So that's just a standard graphite pencil. They're really good for adding realistic metallic sheen to bits and pieces. And I've got some metallic markers. These are pretty convincing metallic colours, and you just draw them straight on with the pen. Another set of paints that I forgot to mention actually is oils, and these are particularly good for weathering. So I would say the standard ones that are really useful to have are a black and a burnt umber, or any other dark brown really. For these I have invested here in the top of the Winsor & Newton range, because the pigmentation in them is really fine, which is really useful when you're doing very thin washes. So these are top-notch ones, but you can start off with cheaper ones. And talking to cheaper ones, that's what I use for other colours that I might need for weathering, or for dot filters. We'll cover what dot filters are later on, but yeah, these are just cheap art things. You can get a whole set for a few pounds. While you're in that cheap art shop, I'd get some pastels as well. As you can see, this is one of my favourite colours. But grinding these up on a piece of sandpaper will give you some dust that you can mix the different colours to make whatever kind of basic mud colour you want, and apply that. Really more of a technique for tanks and armoured cars than it is for aircraft, but these will be useful in aircraft, as we'll see later on. Anyway. Nothing you're going to need is a bit of masking tape, and again, I'm sorry, but I'm going to say Tamiya. Get Tamiya masking tape. Cheap old masking tape is worth having for jobs where you don't need good quality stuff, but this stuff is useful for all sorts of things, from making seat belts in your aircraft or slings on guns, aside from actually masking. And as you'll see from my cutting mat, we never waste any, because when it's been used, it gets stuck back down on the cutting mat and it can be used again. So it lasts a long time, but it's superb stuff, really, really good. These paints all need thinning, and we need to wash our brushes. So when it comes to enamels, that's going to be white spirit. So I have these little tiny jam jars, and that's got a bit of white spirit in there. It looks pretty dirty, I don't know if you can see, but it's pretty filthy in there. Don't worry about that. When it sits, it will settle, and you've got clean white spirit on the top and a layer of sediment underneath. You can keep using that for years, occasionally top it up, but you don't need to throw it away every time it's a little bit dirty. You can keep that for a long time. When it gets really dirty, I use it for doing panel line washes and applying dirt and filth where the dirt in it really doesn't matter, and then have a slightly cleaner one for my general painting. You're going to need some water for acrylics, and so that's just water. Now that you can replace every time it gets dirty, and I would recommend doing so. The next miracle product we're going to show is something that should be widely available. This bottle I've had for years, and it's changed. The product changes its name quite regularly, so it might not be called Clear anymore. But in the supermarket, if you go to the cleaning aisle, you'll find this stuff, which is a floor polish made by Johnson Wax. It smells slightly of ammonia, and is one of the most useful products you could possibly have for model making. It's got a million uses, and we'll cover quite a few of them when we look at the build. One of the main uses is as a gloss varnish, which is something you're going to be needing to do as you do your build. So really useful. Get some of that.